As we go, so
Okay.
don't worry.
Okay, everyone, we're ready to get cracking again. So we have this one session takes us all the way through to lunch. And you can see up on the slide already, it's all about laws, standards, specifications and policies. And Liddy
more.
and more. I'll hand you over to Liddy.
Anything you'd like to contribute, we can have a discussion about. But the session goals, the idea of having this session was really that there are so many places, people, organisations, whatever, working on accessibility. We know what they produce, usually. We know the standards and specifications and so on, but I wanted to focus more on how those things come about. And do they come about in the way that we imagined, and how can we affect how they come about and participate in making them? So that was the sort of rough goal. And with me on the panel I have here, actually, Katie Ellis has called in with an injury to her back, so she's not here. Joan Wild is with us, and she's been charged with all sorts of contributions. Andrew Norman from Melbourne University, Karen Myers, who you heard from earlier this morning, and me. And we're going to do our best to raise the topics, but what we want is your comments and knowledge. And so rather than ask what standard specifications, rules, policies, are there, we're asking how do they come about? What are the roles of those things? And what are the processes and the participation in them? It's amazing what goes on. W3C brings together something like people from 240 different countries to think about the specifications they put out, and a lot of those, as we know, deal with accessibility. The United Nations brings together people from 193 countries to think about what they think is important. ISO brings together people from 162 member states to set up what they think is important. For all of that, we get laws in countries, or we don't get laws, and we get policies placed on the top, regulations, all sorts of things. I think that OZeWAI practitioners have spent years working on the avoidance of discrimination, often disguised as an attempt to reach certain standards of accessibility, but we don't always make something accessible, as we know. So the question is, what can we do now to make our digital world more inclusive? And at this point, I'm going to ask Karen if she would kindly tell us about W3. Would you like to tell it from there, Karen? You don't... Yep.
Now it's on. Now it's green. There we go. So I want to step back a little bit and be careful about policy, because as a standards body, W3C has not been chartered with setting policies. In terms of government and advocacy, that is not our charter. We have put to our membership from time to time the opportunity to even comment in a more formal way about a certain action of not just, open internet, that's sort of a apple pie motherhood expression, an American expression of everyone agrees with that. But we really don't get into the advocacy or policy area, and our members have validated that for us on a couple of occasions. But where we do get involved is looking to the future and looking at what does need to get done. It doesn't mean that we don't liaise or have contact with other policy organizations, with governments, with corporates, nonprofits, of course, and they're among our membership. And it really is the membership that is deciding with us the chartering of new work that gets done, as I mentioned, the 4 on-ramps, working groups, interest groups, business groups, and community groups. We have a very robust strategy team, and that strategy team is looking across these different groups as well as the outside to say what's new, what's on the horizon, what are areas where we might convene a new workshop, we might convene new conversations with communities. And of course, our staff are traveling and engaging, particularly in the accessibility community, worldwide in conferences. A number of them will be at CSUN. So I hope those of a number of folks you've mentioned, Gian, you'll be there, and others. And we actually are co-locating, I think, at least one or more meetings of W3C web accessibility during CSUN. But in terms of the actual process then, our work gets chartered and approved through a pretty robust process of actually creating these charters, and they can be first developed in a community group. It can be brought forward by a member. It can also, that would be a member submission to charter work. The business groups can charter work, interest groups, so a number of different inputs to actually charter a very specific scope of activity that would become a recommendation or a standard. And that then gets reviewed by the strategy team, the management team, the membership, and we need to have at least 5% of the members supporting a new charter of work. And then, of course, our final step is Sir Tim, who gives the final nod as our director, and then it goes on to the standards track. And just to remind people, again, the standards, they're member only or an invited expert, and an organization must make a commitment to the patent policy so that our standards remain royalty-free and open. Once a standard has been developed, goes through many stage gates. It also must have horizontal reviews for accessibility, privacy, security, and internationalization. So those are horizontal reviews for standards. And we also are a past submitter to ISO. So many of you know that WCAG 2.0 is an ISO standard through the past submitter process. And that we only have a few ISO standards, WCAG being one of them, MathML, and Web Services. Those are the three currently that have been, we've submitted through that process. So that's kind of a snapshot, I think, of W3C process and how the standards come about.
Thank you. Are there any questions about that? Or comments? There you are. There's a mic.
Yeah, I've got a question about, I know you great work around when people get to the web and the accessibility of it there, but I'm just wondering, before that, and that is connectivity for those devices we were talking about, accessible gaming devices, and then I'm going to give the example of Braille displays, for instance. Last year there was some talk that the big groups, Microsoft, Apple, Google, were talking between themselves about coming up with a single standard for connecting Braille displays. And I'm wondering, do you get invited to those sort of discussions? Just the connectivity between computers before you even get to the web?
Occasionally we get invited to some of the more industry-specific conversations, and we try to go to as many conferences and events. But specifically in the connectivity, that question is being handled more by a sister organization that Tim founded, which is the Web Foundation, and they're looking more at making sure everyone can have actual connectivity access through a device. But if it's at the API level, then yes, we're interested. But the specific example you mentioned, I'm not aware of. But I will definitely take that back, and you've piqued my interest. Thank you for the question.
Another one?
Hello? Artificial intelligence, is there anything that your organisation is looking at in terms of the effect that AI can have to accessibility in terms of benefits or drawbacks?
Great question. We have a couple of community groups right now looking at artificial intelligence, but next month in Berlin we are convening a workshop, and we are hopeful that we will have contributions from the accessibility community looking at AI. So it's very nascent, it's an emerging technology for us right now. So we don't have an active group specifically around AI and accessibility, but we certainly are open to that, and we hope that some people from the accessibility community will be in Berlin, Germany, at the end of March for this workshop. So thank you. Yeah, follow up.
Just to add on that, can you, swarm intelligence might be something that you might want to add to that list as well.
Okay, I will take that back to our Dom Azal Monsieur is the technical staff who's running that, so I will let him know. Thank you.
I want to ask you a question. One of the groups you named, I forgot what it used to be called, but that reviews stuff to make sure that it's always accessible anyway.
Yeah, the horizontal review, right. So that is done with a number of staff members, and our COO, Ralph Swick, oversees to make sure as part of the process that that happens. And
even if it's not clearly an accessibility issue, if you're not doing something about accessibility, there's still an accessibility test.
Absolutely. And also we have a technical architecture group. They're also looking out across the web, looking across the various groups and making sure that the integrity and architecture of the web is intact. And they also address accessibility and privacy and security as well.
Hi. And I'm mindful of Liddy's advice yesterday about being careful with metaphor, but here I go. In response, Karen, to your comments just on standard versus policy, or standards versus policy, and people who maybe front-end developers here might gather on this one, Agile as a methodology, I remember hearing at one point somebody said Agile's when you sit next to the decision maker and there's not a big channel of communication between different people in different areas. That's Agile. Sitting next, being a person producing something and your client is right next to you, that's Agile. I've heard other explanations of Agile. Where I work, we've gotten involved in the WCAG standards and made them policy. But at the same time, I understand that by another example, the BBC UK have very different standards that aren't WCAG, and they're very good. So about the W3C, Karen, and this is only a comment, standards are great, but because you can be a professional trying to do your best, if you don't sign up to a policy, your best might not be your client's objective, and the standards that you use might not suit your organisation. Policy really helps choosing and throwing in with one direction. So as much as I'm very thankful for the WCAG as a standard, I'm also thankful for policy being something that really means people commit to something.
Right. No, that's good insight. Thank you.
I think one of the things those of us who work with standards think about is that fortunately there's so many you can choose the one you want, which is actually not really the intention, but that's what happens. So I think what you're saying is that policy might tell you to use this standard or that one at a local area. We'll talk about the role of policy a little bit later in this, but I think what we were interested in is the W3C is a very special organisation, of course, and United Nations is another fairly important organisation. So one of you is going to tell us about United Nations.
I can jump in there because I think sometimes what tends to happen, I think, with the W3C is we sometimes tend to look to the W3C to solve all of these other problems which are out there, whereas there's probably other, the W3C and the standards have a very important role, but also there's other it fits in within a wider context of other laws and standards around the world. So I just thought I might just quickly go over those. So that if we look at, sometimes I like a chronology. Sorry, is that microphone still working? No. Okay, so I've got the other one here. So that sometimes a chronology can really help with these things. So if we look back at 1975, there was the UN Declaration of the Rights of Disabled Persons. You know, governments all around the world signed up to this, and people started to develop things around it. At the same sort of time, the first cochlear implant, 1978. Then the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, that was established in Australia in response to this. And you see in other governments around the world, a lot of people established similar legislation in response to them signing up to. Part of the process of signing up to these conventions is you agree to promote standards within your country and enact laws. So that's what Australia did back then. We created the Disability Discrimination Act after the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission got created. The JAWS screen reader, 1995, first came out. That was the first one. OZeWAI, 1998, so not that long after JAWS came out. WCAG 1.0, that was 1999, so we can see that some of these UN stuff was already in existence, people pushing for it there, but maybe the standards part of it came a little bit later. In Australia, we saw the first successful action of somebody bringing a Maguire versus SOCOG when Bruce Maguire wanted to buy tickets to go to the Sydney Olympic Games and couldn't access the website, and successfully bought an action there. So that sort of enforced in Australia the right to access to the web. Then under the Disability Discrimination Act, the government has the power to enact standards. And so in 2005, there were disability standards for education, that they can actually enact standards in relation to anything they like, actually, under the Disability Discrimination Act. But at present, there's only 3 of them. So there's disability standards for education, disability standards for public transport, and disability standards for access to premises. And the area in which this becomes really important is the difference between if we look at the legal duties. I should have mentioned I'm a solicitor. Is that there's 2 interesting concepts, which is the concept of ex ante duties, which means before the fact. So this is a duty which somebody has that they have to do before the fact, and then there's ex nunc duties, which are things which happen after the fact. So what these disability standards do is that they introduce these ex ante requirements. So, for example, in education, the disability standards for education say that if you've got a student who has a disability and they declare that they have a disability, you must meet with them and then discuss what accommodations they need for their course. So that's the sort of thing of saying, okay, they tell you that what they need, and so you prepare accessible materials for for that particular student, if that's what is required for that particular student. But then we've got these other set of duties which are ex nunc duties, which exist once somebody makes you aware of the fact that they need the service. So you might have, again, in the education context, we might have somebody who's already registered as a student, and so we've made some adjustments for them, but then they say, oh look, I've got dyslexia, I'm trying to access a PDF, the black on the white is too strong for me, I can't access that, and so an accommodation might be made for that individual because they've raised that point, which is, we'll provide it in Word so that you could set your own background might be the adjustment. But that's a very important distinction between those 2 things, and sometimes in the Australian legal context, what we tend to happen is it can be very hard for somebody when they bring an action, is that people respond to it doing this thing of, oh, you've told us about your the issue which you're having, and we'll respond to it now rather than preparing beforehand. So and so I'll come back to that later, why that's really important. Then we've got, in 2006, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came out. The iPhone came out 2007. WCAG 2.0, 2009. National Transition Strategy 2010. So that started to, apply to government. Doesn't apply to private enterprise, but some of these other principles, when somebody goes to court to say that they can't access your site, the courts are going to look back at all of these other things, UN Convention, the legislation, the standards which are in place in order to come up with a thing of determining what you should have done, what's reasonable behaviour. So then we've got 2014, we've got OZeWAI ARIA came out, ATAG 2.0 in 2015. Then we've got the European Standard for Procurement coming out in 2016. So that's another one too. I think sometimes people look to the W3C to be providing advice on procurement when there's actually probably other bodies who are providing that advice, and it's already in development. Then we've got OZeWAI ARIA 2017, WCAG 2.1 in 2018. The authoring practices 2019, and then now probably the next big thing which is on the go in Australia is the fact that the Human Rights Commission are doing a review of access to technology in Australia. They're proposing that one of their recommendations is that there be another one of these standards. I mentioned that there's 3 of them at the moment, and those standards are really good because they create positive duties for people. So in relation to public transport, that's why you see a reserved seating space for somebody who has a wheelchair, because it's specifically in there creating these duties which people must do before the fact, but they're also looking to bring in a standard in relation to digital communication. And so that's still in draft, and I would definitely encourage people there looking for feedback on that, but that's going to be one, at the moment, that's their draft recommendation, is to recommend that they create one of these standards in relation to digital communication. And so that could be a very useful sort of thing, because at the moment there isn't these standards like the one for education. They came out in 2005, as we've seen. They've never been updated. So there's no mention in there of anything of the internet, not mentioned at all. So, but if you're a prudent organisation, so probably Adam's going to talk later about the banks and that sort of thing. If you're a prudent organisation, you're looking at all of these standards and saying, well, if we end up in court, what should we do? We mightn't be anything directly telling us what we should do, but we can reasonably anticipate what would happen if somebody brought an action against us. And so instead of doing that, let's just try and foresee what would happen and act accordingly before that. So that's just a little plotted overview of how things fit in.
Any questions? Yes.
Thank you. Just noticing there was a 9-year difference between WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. Do you think that the speed of business is moving too fast for the process of putting these standards in place?
So firstly, I just need to apologise because I have to leave halfway through. But yes, the W3C is a great organisation, but it does move very, very slowly, and business and industry moves much faster. And so one of the reasons why I'm on this panel is because I have spent the last couple of years chairing a committee writing mobile site testing guidelines, and we're now going to have a committee to write wearable guidelines and VR and AR guidelines as well. And our kind of commitment is that we release new guidelines and methodologies every year, and that the committees are open in a way that the W3C sometimes isn't. And if you have a problem, then that's fine, we'll fix it in the next iteration. And that was something that came out of a conference that occurs every year for accessibility testing specialists in DC, where basically, you know, they had a bit of a fishbowl kind of situation, and they sort of said, we really need mobile testing guidelines because every single accessibility consultant is doing it differently. And so that's why we put these guidelines together, and it's something that we hope will be able to be incorporated into WCAG at some point. But yeah, that is definitely problematic, that there's really been 10 years difference between WCAG 1 and WCAG 2, and 10 years difference between WCAG 2 and 2.1. And 2.2, I'm not sure if you have a date for 2.1, the 2.2. Yeah, so, but, you know, there's, the W3C has a number of restrictions due to the way that it's organised. And so, because it's often, I suppose, not as stringent as some people would hope. And certainly that was the opinion of the accessibility people that I've talked to when it comes to mobile accessibility, that 2.1 really didn't address those requirements as much as it should have. So it's not a case that we're trying to replace the W3C, but it's more a case of we're trying to provide some guidance until it gets incorporated into the W3C. So we're definitely aware that that's a problem with the W3C standards process.
In fact, I think these processes are really complicated, as well as the number of people involved. I thought I'd just go through what the word standards comes up in the context for me is Standards Australia, because we often call what I think are W3C specifications that have been standardised. They're called standards when they're not necessarily standards. Standards Australia is the official body in this country that registers the standards for Australia. And they represent in Australia the International Standards Organisation and the International Electrotechnical Commission, as it happens. And their role, they're sort of an independent body that is recognised as the central body, and their role is to enable stakeholders from a variety of sectors ways to come up with standards. So they're really about getting the people who are involved in the situation to build the standards that they need. That's the idea. And to help people participate for their own, where it's going to affect them in international standards development, and to recognise other entities that are doing the work of standards so that those come. But the significant thing is that Standards Australia keeps a huge long list of standards, and there are millions and zillions of them, literally, but it's not responsible for any of them being actually implemented. So the fact that you can buy a plug in the supermarket and take it home and put it in your bath is thanks to Standards Australia. People know what size the bath plug hole is going to be, and so on. It's screws, it's all sorts of things. And they are engaging in accessibility in several ways as well. So what Standards Australia tries to do is to bring together the key parties and stakeholders to form a technical committee that thinks about developing standards that will be relevant for Australia and of value to Australia. So you have to show, if you want to do something with Standards Australia, that there is a value to Australia in doing it. You probably have to show there's a value in money for Standards Australia to buy copies, but I'm not going to say that too officially. And then once you're accredited like that, you can participate in the drawing up of these standards. And they can be standards that come from scratch. So we could engage, pick up some issue we want to, and if we got industry support, we could follow it through with them. And the accreditation function is a bit like the one I'm going to say is in ISO, where you can recognise that the Engineers Association are the best people for saying the standards of gears and things. And very often what they do is what Karen was referring to this morning, is develop the ontology. What is it that matters in this industry? And how do you describe it so that you can actually talk about it and create standards around it? Standards Australia also coordinates the participation of Australians in international meetings. And in fact, it turns out that we contribute a lot in international meetings of different kinds. What I think is interesting is the technical committees are made up of experts from the relevant industry and consumer associations involved with it. So start thinking about OZeWAI's role in here, please. one of the things that ISO does is work on consensus. That's something that we hear from practically all these organisations, and they produce new standards and technical reports. They review the standards they've already got and can dismiss them or replace them or update them, and they adopt standards from other organisations. So, for example, ISO now says if W3 wants to give us something to make it an international standard, we will pretty much just say yes, thank you very much for that. And my experience is that once it actually hits ISO, it's very likely to go straight on and become a standard in Europe. It then can go through a process in Australia as well, where we say, yes, do we want this international standard to become a standard in Australia? So you can imagine a W3C specification goes through the process of W3C, it then can go to ISO, become an ISO standard, and then a derivative becomes an Australian standard. It's sort of interesting, though, I think, on any of these organisations, how do they work? Because that's the critical thing. And when we go to ISO meetings, we sit in rooms with all sorts of experts. Some of those experts have been promoted by their country as experts, and some of them are people who've been recognised and invited in because of their expertise. So the expert technical groups do work. But when the work is done, consensus has to be reached. And consensus is not, does the working group think it's lovely, but what do the nations out there who are ISO members think about it? And I think that's an interesting thing I'll talk about in a second. Usually that process, even where you've got a fast process, takes about 3 years to establish something, write about it, get it through the committees and have it published. So standards don't come out fast, and I think that's something we have to recognise. It's really hard to get standards, and sometimes I think there's some interesting cases in W3C where actually for 20 years people have been working on WCAG. So there's a whole new generation of people who don't know that all those things were dealt with 20 years ago. They do with them again, and you can't help that if you're trying to get consensus in a current situation. But it worries me what consensus means. It's achieved by voting in ISO. Well, that's not quite consensus of the expert group that's done the work. It's voted on by national bodies who've paid the fees. So Australia participates in some ISO standard making, but not all. So unless Australia has chosen to pay up for that particular thing, they're not there. Countries that don't participate actively get dropped in status. So you have to vote, and to be honest, you get bombarded with things every week. Vote on this, vote on that, vote on the other. Not everybody understands everything that they have to vote on. So the voting is, what am I going to say about this? I don't actually understand this. But if I don't vote, or Australia doesn't vote, Australia will be said not to be active. And so actually one of the things is that you can abstain, and that is at least counted as voting. But what we see is people like to vote yes or no. So you get a country that has absolutely no participation in a particular field, and there's nobody represented and perhaps hasn't read it who says yes or no. So there is a problem where you have a system like this because stuff can get through. An example for me was somebody doing something for the a standard for education, and he couldn't tell us what he was doing because it was designed for the Defence Force educating its own staff, and he couldn't tell us how many this, that and the others, and the whole thing was secret all the way through, and he was the only person that actually understood what it was. But all sorts of countries that we'd never heard from, except that they have paid their money, voted for this thing, which gave him a monopoly in that business field. So, these things are very difficult to work out. What is the system that you should have to actually be sure that what you're talking about is, and I think the word standards meant to mean, what is it that people in the industry agree to do so that they can work together? And I think W3 actually does that bit of it extremely well. And I think one of the problems we have in some other organisations is that there's political dimensions, there's financial dimensions and so on, and it can be a little bit difficult. So I'm hoping that OZeWAI will actually be recognised when it's got its new name next year as an industry body that needs to participate in the Australian standards development, and we can bring forward our own standards. We can recommend that things come. For example, if we decided that we wanted to pick up something like the mobile work that Jan's group's done, we could actually start to do that sort of thing. It's there, but we need to be organised as a professional organisation in order to do that. So, yep, questions?
Thanks, Liddy. I just wanted to suggest or even propose or just even think about the example that you gave of the bath plug and the drain. I think it's a really great example, but I actually don't think it's relevant. The reason being, I thought it was great because it told me exactly what standards are all about and it made sense as to why. But the problem that I have with it is that the bath plug and the sink hole, they're self-regulating. I mean, if I go and buy a plug and it doesn't fit my sink hole, I'm going to get up in arms and I'm going to go and complain and take it back. But that doesn't happen with these standards. It's if Standards Australia or the person who's doing the voting or the participation is not involved in the enforcement, then who is?
It's a very big problem. And I think, yeah.
I'll be with you. John, can I have one? Oh, sorry.
That's a typical example of the sort of problem. That's a typical example of the sort of...
That's not a standard mic.
Yeah, and when we think about when we're actually writing the standards, you can put in what you think will be compliance with the standard. But if people don't adopt it or don't choose to do it, there's nothing you can do. So the bath manufacturer has to want to produce a standard size plug hole. And it's much more complicated, the work we're doing. We can't just say it's this particular dimension. That's the problem we have, I think.
I guess I'll just have 2 points. So on the standard side, I think one of the things that we look for in the tech space, and sorry, I'm Steve from Atlassian, is interoperability. We want the plugins and the ecosystem that works with us to work well and function well with our products and kind of have the same thing. So we struggle to, I guess, make our or kind of enable our vendors to be more accessible because we have to provide that platform for them. And so on that, what we want to do is we want an easy way to consume something like a standard. More often than not, when I'm talking to people internally, they're like, is there a standard for this? Is there just a thing that I can follow that will give me a good percentage of coverage that I can work from? And then is there a standard way of testing? We do default to the WCAG, but I think what it misses out on is some of those other conversations where we need examples. So a conversation that came up today is the difference between interactive modals and interactive content and the way that should be used. We don't have any good examples of where those two things are, so we're struggling to build that on our own. So it's good that the W3C is looking at this and there's a community talking about it, because I think even when there's a standard, not having those examples is really difficult. And just the other thing, just the last thing on that is that when there is a laborious standard, when it's too big and too complicated to follow, we very quickly, as Gian pointed out, we want to move quickly. We've got a lot of things that we're trying to ship in a very short space of time. And as soon as that becomes too complicated for our developers and our engineers to implement, they'll just put that as the lower priority. And so we need something that's lightweight enough that gets a good percentage of the work done without it being, I guess, an extra week or 2 weeks or 5 weeks of time that they can think about as early as possible, so they're not getting slammed with that at the end. So there's a lot in that.
Yeah, I think you said a word, though, that's terribly important, and that's interoperability. I think we constantly, when you're playing the standards, one of the things is what on earth is going to make it possible for people to work together. So, but I don't know whether we can use Standards Australia somehow in this country to speed up some of these things so that we can at least, if you don't declare it, that's why I picked up the ontology word that Karen was using. If you don't declare something, then it can't be discussed. But we need a place where you can declare it. You can say this is what we want to do. We want other people to tell us where they're going to do it, whether they can interoperate and so on. And that, I think that's very off the line. I forgot to say that ISO standards are very expensive. So most people don't buy them anyway, but if a standard comes from some other source, for example, W3C, or in my case, work we've done in other places, as we bring that into ISO, we can say you can only have it if you make it freely available. So on the slide I've got there, I've got where you can get ISO standards for free, and there are a lot of them that you can get for free. And they may well be the ones that you want because they're to do with accessibility and education. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, sort of question and comment. I mean, this is hugely interesting. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, this is usually interesting for me because when I started the Digital Gap initiative 5 years ago, it was during my case against calls online. And it's when I learned about the difference, between a standard which is run by Standard Australia, or standard that in law, which is not in law. I was speaking a little bit more about that in the afternoon. But so a couple of points. Firstly, about what Australia is not involved in the ISO, the International Standards Organization. Thank you. Technology is wonderful when it works. But yeah, so in the International Standards Organization, I think there's a standard called Standard ISO 71, which is how to set accessibility in standard. And Australia is actually not part of that standards committee internationally, which to me, needs to be looked at. Secondly, what I've learned through my advocacy work is that a standard has to be passed in law in order to be enforceable. Otherwise, it's just a voluntary standard. And most Australian standards, including EN 301549, the procurement standard, although it's been passed under procurement law for Australian government services, but it's not cited in any legislation. And until it is cited in legislation, until a standard is cited in legislation, then it is strictly a voluntary and it cannot be enforced. I mean, the solicitor here could say a little bit more about that. And yes, so one of the things that Digital Gap is looking at is Australian consumer law as well. And the ACCC has got some ability to enforce some standards and to even take companies to court and so on. But accessibility is not really strongly highlighted under Australian consumer law. So all these things are things that, not only to Digital Gap, but I hope through OZeWAI that we can look at in the future.
Thank you. I think that there is definitely work to be done, and it's just where do we start? But we certainly need to do some work. Yep.
Thank you for so that standards definition.
Thank you, John.
That standard definition I think was great and I think is absolutely critical. Has either W3C or OZeWAI incorporated into their vision in terms of medium long term the increase in business maturity, or in terms of maturity where things go from standards to guidelines to principles, and then eventually, from what a couple of people have already said, then moving to self-organisation. Have you got things like that in terms of your vision?
I think we give that to W3C.
That's actually a very good question. And yes, we are much more conscious of that, not only in the accessibility activity, but in several of the other vertical activities. So the OZeWAI Education and Outreach group is putting a lot more on their agenda. However, we can only move as fast as the number of volunteer people who are participating in these groups. The strategy team also is looking out at, not only the standards work, but what's next and what else needs to be in terms of best practices or educational materials. That's where some of these community groups and business groups are coming in, and we're seeing in publishing in particular that they're starting to create checker tools and more educational materials in a much faster track. So there's definitely raised the consciousness. We've organized ourselves to have faster response. It still does take a while to do the standards track work, for sure, because of the interoperability. We need at least 2 interoperable implementations to declare a standard. But I think it's a great question. I'm here also to take feedback back to the OZeWAI team and our strategy team. So this is extremely helpful to get regional input from Australia, and that's great feedback. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm really interested in sort of the discussion that's really happening around standards and how they get applied here in this country, because we do have this really unique, it's kind of law but not really situation. And I'm curious where the panel feels that the Human Rights Commission comes into this, because they do play a huge part. Their advisory notes do currently recommend WCAG. So there is sort of a set standard in Australia, WCAG 2.0 to level AA currently, and certainly when I sat down last year with the Human Rights Commission in Sydney, they told me, oh yes, we're moving forward. And I know that some of us participated at a round table about AI and the future of AI for people with disabilities. Those conversations are happening, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks the role that they play is and how important that role is, because that's really, certainly from WebKey IT's point of view, where we end up pointing to is the Human Rights Commission and their advice for people.
I want to answer that in a slightly oblique way and ask others to do it differently, but I chair a thing called the Disability Discrimination Legal Service in Victoria. And one of the problems we have is that you have to wait until someone's discriminated against, and then, because you don't actually know what you have to do for them, and if you do happen to go to court, and people don't get usually as far as that, it's only then that you actually find out what you should have done. So I think a huge problem for people is that we don't know what we need to do. If I do this, will I be all right? Not necessarily at all. And we know the limitations of whichever set of standards you happen to choose. They're all limited in some way or other. So I think we have a serious problem in this country because of the way we do our law. And I think that's often not appreciated. We don't have a sort of a Bill of Rights that you can go to court and say, I should have got this. It doesn't work like that. It actually works like, I missed out on that. And people have then decide, well, that's your bad luck, or you shouldn't have missed out on that, you missed out on something. But the answer to missing out is not actually WCAG. The answer is whether you got what you wanted or not. And it's a slightly different question. And so the answer is not WCAG. WCAG, or the equivalent, is used to show that you did try as the provider to do the right thing. But if the person has missed out, then it may be that you just had to give them a telephone number to solve the problem, or lots of other things that are nothing to do with WCAG could come into it. And it's really hard to work backwards, and that's what I think Andrew was saying with the law that says what you have to do and you're fine. And we know if we go below the speed limit, we'll be okay. But if it's up to someone's to do a reasonable speed, how do I know what reasonable speed is? And this is the wording that we deal with in this country. And it's because of our legal system being built the way it is with its history. We love it. We think it's fantastically good sometimes. And sometimes it makes it really difficult. And I think the Human Rights Commission is caught in that they can't really change the law at that level. So they're working underneath the DDA and something, but they're then doing their best. But I'd like Andrew's comments.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting point that you make, is that people often, there's a difference between having a negative duty and a positive duty. So really, things in the Disability Discrimination Act is saying you mustn't discriminate, rather than a positive duty to actually do something. Whereas often in those disability standards, which I mentioned earlier, which have been created, create more of a positive duty. So in terms of public transport, if you read through those standards, they say, you know, a train platform must have tactile matting on the platform. So it's very detailed and the sort of stuff which we are normally more familiar with web. Yeah, you must do a particular thing. So I'm hopeful that the standards, if this comes to fruition with the Human Rights Commission recommending things at the moment, that will help. But I think too, stepping back a little bit from that, I like looking at surveys of organisations and motivations for things. And so often a lot of us, we look at these WebAIM surveys on screen reader usage, but also too the IAAP did a survey in terms of asking them members what was the organisational motivation for accessibility, and they really were three main drivers. So one of them is the legal part of it, but equally as prevalent amongst organisations is people wanting to just do the right thing. So that's quite a strong driver as well, and also just following best practice and standards, so quality standards. So I think sometimes if we just hang a hat on one of those things, which has been the legal part of it, we're not really going to get where we're going. So I know for me in a university, is the legal part of it doesn't really appeal to people in the university. In fact, the other part of it, it's the right thing to do. We're about education. We want our students. People just get that, and actually they don't need any convincing at all. So it's, especially amongst senior management. So I think that wider context is important.
No, I agree. And we do, I think there are those three main reasons anyone in the profession kind of hears is there's the legal risk, which is fairly low here. In Australia, the right thing to do, and then making that business case for extended market base, which I think we probably all have experienced all of those. I guess my one comment, and this is probably pushback that I see because we work with lots of corporates. We want to do it because it's the right thing to do, but it gets deprioritized for lots of reasons, and there are lots of things that just become better priority. So I think that, and we have to be careful not to use too much stick, particularly because we don't have a big stick to swing in Australia. There is no real legal ramifications. However, if there's no stick, so I'm giving a presentation tomorrow about the surveys that we sent around earlier last year, and one of the things that came back, spoiler alert, 80% globally of the users who responded to the survey said that the laws in their country were not sufficient for accessibility. So lots of people feel like there isn't a big enough stick, and I think we don't want to lead with it, but there also has to be a component there, a reason to do it. So I think there's just a balance there. That's all.
Yeah, I think not big enough stick is an interesting concept. One of the things that bothers me is that government organisations, who should know better, are very good at making blanket, we care for everybody and we're all here for you and our service is for you. That's as far as it goes. They're good at making overarching statements which mean nothing. And that really worries me because I'm paying them, as is everybody in here. And they are not completely, but to a large extent, doing nothing except making sweet noises.
Thanks. So we had a comment a bit earlier around standards to guidelines to principles. Now, for me, as someone who's done a lot of work with many of Australia's corporates, and including one of the big four banks for about 10 years, looking back at that, if we don't have standards, if we move to guidelines and then principles, they're not going to get implemented because the standards are what people look at to go, okay, this is what I can follow to actually do this thing. It's then the job of the person in the organisation responsible for accessibility or to lead the accessibility effort, because I think it's everybody's responsibility, to then work through how you get that standard implemented within that organisation. If you move to a more sort of guideline basis, then I think you open yourself up to, well, they're guidelines, we could follow them more, maybe we do our own thing. And I think that's where the W3C has a huge role to play, because it's an internationally recognised set of standards, and I think that's what we probably need to continue with. It's just about how do we make those standards more probably understandable to the general population is, I think, where we need to go next.
Your general population is not, I assume, the end user, but is the bank or the whatever.
So I guess what I mean by the general population is the non-accessibility people. Because at the moment, WCAG is understandable to you or I or the more sort of accessibility-centric people that are working in the space to actually implement the standards, right? You put WCAG in front of a developer, and 9 times out of 10 they're going to sit there and go, yeah, but what does this actually mean? What do I need to do? Can you break it down for me? And I think, for me, there's a role for organisations like the W3C in helping demystify some of that, and some of it's happening, but I think there's a bit more to come.
And I'm thinking how difficult that is when it's an international context, because you want to be specific. We want the W3C to be specific to help Australians, but people in some other country might want a different way of doing it. It's a very hard thing to do that suits everyone, isn't it? It's quite tricky. Yep. We'll swap here.
Hi, Christos Petru here. I agree with Adam, but as WCAG states, the G stands for guidance, is not a policy. And it's a good guidance to follow, but again, if we don't follow or companies don't put it part of their process, it's just a guidance. It's not a policy that we have to implement. What brings W3C to become a policy is countries enforcing it and saying we need to follow this guidance. What I find often, I agree with Adam, often the guidance is not translated correctly when it comes to developers and how they're going to implement it. So I guess more examples on how different components are used by developers, it will be better.
Well, I think too is having a look at what's been successful around the world, and I think, especially in the US, the Section 508 has made a massive difference to if you could pick one, piece of legislation which has had a huge impact across the world, it's that piece of legislation, because I know as somebody who assesses a lot of software for the university, if I get a piece of software that's from the US, it's much more likely to be accessible than something which is developed in Australia. And that's sad, because it'd be good to buy local, but if it's coming from the US, I normally think, all right, if they've sold into government, they will have had to have made this more accessible. So I think sometimes those procurement standards can make a big difference. And so even, I know with us at the university now, putting it into the procurement process is very important. We have it in our contracts. All of our standard IT contracts say that the software has to be WCAG compliant. If it's not, we can withhold payment to the vendor.
In US, they have the VPAT, it's a legal document that states the accessibility of each product. So they follow the WCAG guidelines, but then they have to complete the VPAT. And if the person responsible for completing that VPAT lies to it, they can end up in jail. So that's the difference between guidelines and having a document that is completed and it's available on procurement when you buy a product.
Yeah,
it's something we don't have
I
here.
think too that what other organisations are doing is to say, okay, we're going to is to adopt a bit of a risk approach. So in terms of procurement, I have indicators which identify something as being a low risk or a high risk product. So the number of people who are going to use it, are we talking 15 researchers in a lab, or are we talking something which every student is going to access? How much are we going to spend on this? Are we talking something which is a $200 piece of software, or are we talking something we're spending, over $400,000 on? And so we have a bit of a scale to say, okay, if it's below a certain threshold, we'll look at the vendor's documentation and we'll try and put it in the contract. But once it hits a certain threshold, it has to have an accessibility assessment. So we're not just relying on the VPAT. That will involve me looking at it, getting users to test the product. So I think having that scale can be a good way of getting around that problem.
Sure.
Yeah, so I have a lot of problem with that, Andrew, because what I find is, you might have 2,000 people who want, who go over the threshold, and then say 400 users who go under the threshold. But, you could have a percentage of those 400 users who would have a disability. And so what we're finding is, software is brought in, whether it's to universities, to government departments, and we're promised that it's accessible. When it comes in, it's not accessible. People's jobs are at risk. And, they're not thousands of people's jobs at risk, but, you've got maybe 10, well, if you're lucky, at this stage, whose jobs are at risk because it hasn't been tested. It's gone under that scale.
Well, I think that's a good one, but I suppose if you've got an organisation which is massive and it's just purchasing, stuff all the time, it's actually very hard to get people to do all of those tests on every piece of software. But at the same time, if you can build in, things in which obviously you have to respond to that, to users if they have problems. Sorry, this microphone's dying again, I think. But is getting to know your user base as well, and to see what products are likely to have the most impact on people. But I think not all products are the same, have the same risk. But also you've got to work with your users to know what sort of what users are affected by a particular product. So I think within my organisation, I know a lot of the users. I'd say probably almost all of them I have contact with now and again. I'm familiar with their setup and what they're doing, so I can, highlight some of those things if they're ones which are, going to be particularly the case. But apart from that, is to get something into the contracts, because often for organisations to bring an action against somebody who's made a misrepresentation in the selling process, organisations are very loath to do that. It's very expensive, and so maybe having the thing of withholding part payment can be quite a good one, because as soon as I do that and we put it in there, the vendor suddenly, they're self-disclosing because they see that thing about losing the 5% and they go, oh yeah, actually there are a few things, that we've got,
But also, what I've always argued around here is demand affects supply. So if there's a demand for accessible products, regardless of, whether they fall above the scale or below the scale, wouldn't then the production actually just move towards making everything accessible anyway?
I don't disagree that if you had that's why these government things of saying, well, we're not going to buy stuff unless it's accessible. But I think we're still at the stage where people do make misrepresentations in these VPATs. I think too, even that VPAT system does not really reward developers who are being honest about their product, because if you're a developer that's maybe Atlassian, you might be working on it, but you know that there are defects in the product, and so sometimes vendors will put in there that they have a known defect, and I'm actually suspicious of anybody who's saying that there's no defects, but if they're saying that defects are in there, then they can do that. But also too, what some other organisations are doing is getting procurement officers to do that bit of assessment themselves of the VPAT when it's coming through, so that they can, even on these smaller software products. So I'm not saying that you're not assessing that at all, but obviously to do a process whereby you're getting in 10 users, you're scheduling in a couple of weeks of testing to do, to run through, create content, it takes a lot of time to do all of that if you're going to do it for every product.
We're getting a big long queue of people here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doc. Adam, we'll come back up to you and then we'll come back over.
So I think part of the problem, and to pick up on what Christos said about the VPAT, is we've got guidelines, right? And even with the VPAT, my understanding of the V in VPAT is voluntary. So, they either choose or not to provide the VPAT. So, we're still in this situation where if there isn't a standard that is accepted that we can rely on, you're still kind of leaving it to the organisation that is building the thing or the implementers to go, well, am I or am I not going to follow the guidelines? And yes, 508 is different in the US. It's the legislation is much stronger, but I think we're still in that sort of problem area.
And I was going to comment in the education thing, it's those people who declare themselves as having a disability, but there might be somebody with a disability who doesn't declare themselves, and the education system just washes its hands of those people, and that's a problem too, that wording can be very tricky, can't it?
Adam, sorry for that, or apologies for a misinterpretation, I suppose. I 100% agree with you and what everyone else has said. Standards are absolutely critical right now. I was just looking at future for when the system becomes more mature, where it's moving from have to want to, and that's when guidelines is more appropriate.
Are you taking yippee beans or something?
Thanks.
We'd love it to be mature.
Future, yes. So I agree with you.
Can I respond? I just wanted to pick up on the point about a couple of points that Adam and Steve made also. One was the broadness of some of the standards at W3C, and we are moving into a much more modular approach. And the CSS working group, for example, is doing very well. That's a much more modular approach, and encouraging, we'll take this feedback back to the OZeWAI team, because I hope they will also do that even to a greater degree. And we're also within the organization at W3C discussing evergreen standards, how to have this continuous improvement and be much faster. So again, just sort of a heads up, that's going to be on our agenda for our member meeting in May.
Thank you. So I'm speaking this afternoon, and I hope everyone just be gentle with me, because because I'm definitely not gentle to you. But I think one of the reasons why I'm asking these questions is because one of the applications that we're making at the moment at our company is it operates a little bit different, and so therefore we've got to think quite differently about accessibility. And to do that, we can't follow the standards per se. We need to think of different ways of making it accessible. And we're running into a real risk of having something which is not accessible. But because it is so rich in terms of the information that it gives, we can't use the standards to a large degree. And so therefore, I think the real question was, for companies that are trying to move forward in terms of new ways of thinking, we run the risk of not being accessible, which is kind of limiting us a lot in terms of how we develop these new ways of applications. Have you got any suggestions or recommendations?
Absolutely. That's why W3C exists. Please join the conversation. If you're not at the table and sharing these challenges, we don't know. So please come find a way. We'll talk afterwards to be at the table and start bringing these issues to our attention. Absolutely.
Hi, Christos again. I agree. Accessibility it can be complex, especially in large products. And what I want to make a suggestion to think about is like any other product we develop. There is no product out there that doesn't have a defect. If anyone has a product that is defect-free, I'll eat my shoes. But we should treat the same way accessibility. It's okay to have issues. The thing is, how do we handle them when we know about them, and how quickly do we resolve them? There is no product that is 100% accessible, and accessibility is a journey. And every issue we fix, it just makes the product better. We had Microsoft Word documents started back in the 80s, and we keep getting new versions because things are getting better every year. Every day things are improving. So we cannot be 100% inclusive, we cannot be 100% accessible, but we can get closer to include more people to be able to use our products. So VPAD is a good example. Yes, it's voluntary, but if somebody asks for a product and they ask for the VPAD, the companies who are selling the products, they have to provide it, and it's a legal document once they provide it. And it's okay to identify issues, because then is the next step. You provide an action plan to the company of what they can target and fix. And if there is a litigation against them, they have steps and strategy to accommodate for those issues they already known. So it's a process, and it cannot be 100% accessible. And if it's complex, you can meet some guidelines, and you can then build on it from the lessons learned.
Hi everyone, I'm Troy. I'm from Microsoft. Glad to hear Word's getting better. I'm not a developer. I don't work directly at what we call, the back end with technology. So my role is, and I'm going to go somewhere with this. I'm not being narcissistic, telling you all about me. I work in the education department. Well, with the education departments, with peak bodies, Cath Ed, independent schools, Victoria, South Australia, etc. A strategy that I had, and understand that from Microsoft, and we heard from Tatiana yesterday when she was talking about Bill Gates. Microsoft is a business, right? So Microsoft is looking for ins to push their product. So what I've learned with being in this role with accessibility is that it's become very apparent to Microsoft that it is a very powerful business tool. It drives usage, it drives adoption. We're not just broadening the markets, but in hitting things like standards, etc., where we're forcing people to use our product over another product, etc. The problem I have, and this is what I wanted to sort of open up to the group, and if anyone wants to help me with this, is when I go into even large education departments like Victoria, which is a huge amount of people, 600,000, licensed users, this kind of thing. And I say to them about standards or about expectations around accessibility, they have no idea, right? I'm sure there's people somewhere in the organisation that may have some knowledge, but really, by and large, no idea. What would be advantageous for us, and I think in terms of helping you guys as well, leveraging business, is if you could help us to work out what it is, in fact, that they do need. What is the non-choice standards, this kind of stuff, and then you could use us and probably Apple and Google for that in that way as well, to go out and having these conversations directly to these people. Like I've got sales teams that I work with who have a voice right to the DepSec of these organisations, and if we could actually train these sales guys and girls to go in and say, did you know this is what you should be doing? And then, here's how Microsoft can meet that need, or, Google saying, here's how Google could meet that need. I think that would be advantageous to the movement here. So I'm putting my hand up saying, tell me, teach me.
Troy, we're so pleased that Microsoft has decided to be so helpful to us. Yeah. No, but seriously, it does. We're going to end this session now, but I think that it is a really interesting thing that people who are doing very well in the industry are asking, how do we do better? I mean, it's not just that we're sitting here as a bunch of people saying we're not getting what we want. It is questionable, how do you do better? And everybody has to work together. And I think it's an opportunity for us as an association to start to answer some of these questions. Perhaps it's a use case you put up on our forum, and people will, I'm sure, give you some suggestions. Some you won't want, but some would be helpful. And I think we can't possibly, as an organisation, move forward by ourselves. We do need to be working with all of you people who've got really good ideas and so on. I'm going to ask you to thank my fellow panellists, including John, who's not here anymore. I think it's actually been the most amazing session. I'm absolutely thrilled, Karen, to have you here and talking about this, because I think so often we have a very nice front, but we don't actually get to ask the person the question, do we? And I really appreciate your participation. And Andrew, I think it's terrific to have you with your critical mind too. I know you had some more critical points if we dug deeper, so challenge him later on if you want some more. But also the contributions from the floor have been really interesting. So that's where we are. We're an organisation of people who understand the problems, who are gathering the problems, who sometimes understand the solutions. Let's make it all happen.
Excellent. Well done all.